We now move on to the Sicilian defence, and the system that I'd like to recommend against this is the so-called Grand Prix attack. Now this was made famous, or very popular, by players on the English weekend tournament circuit. First of all, a player named David Rumans, and after him Mark Hebden, who used to win so many games in these weekend tournaments, and therefore he got christened the Grand Prix attack, because there was a Grand Prix of all these weekend tournaments. And it's since been taken up by, well, many English players. It's a real English speciality, but not only English players. There are other players that have also made a living out of using this system, as we're going to see. It is extremely dangerous. The idea is that we're holding the centre firm and we're attacking usually with our f-pawn on the king side. So let me paint the broad picture with the first few games, and then we'll get into detail. So knight c3. The idea of knight c3 is that it prevents black from breaking with d5 when you play your flank attack with f4. So white sets his stall out right from the very opening that he's going to attack on the king side. And we'll see from this game how it can catch out very, very strong players indeed. And the system I'm going to recommend is with bishop b5, not the original Grand Prix move, bishop c4. I'll explain why a little bit later on. But I think that, well, bishop c4 has basically been superseded. Okay, excuse me. Bishop b5, and now knight d4. We'll discuss this position in some detail later on, but just for the moment let's get the broad brush strokes of the position. And black takes the bishop on b5, not a bad move, and plays d6 and d3. a4, it's possible that's to preempt black's play on the queen side, but it's not strictly necessary. And now we see the familiar strategy, if that's not too sophisticated a term, that white uses in the Grand Prix attack. Queen e1. It's not subtle. We've moved our f-pawn up the board, and that makes way for the queen to head for the king side and an attack on the king. And black castles. Well, the problem is if you don't castle, then you can end up in trouble with e5. So the king really has to evacuate. And queen h4, and already this is a very difficult position for black actually. He's under a lot of pressure. And here he gets it very wrong. And now f5. So this is the familiar move, the standard move, f5. Not only do you open up pressure on the f-file for the rook, but what's important is you open up the line of the bishop as well, down to h6 or sometimes g5. So here, for example, if black were to take on f5, well, you wouldn't bother recapturing. This is standard. You can play bishop h6, and if takes, then you have knight g5. And white is winning already because we're just going to take here and take on f6, and h7 falls. So terribly simple. a6 played, and b5. Well, I think that shows that a4 wasn't strictly necessary because black is going to get this in anyway, but to be honest, the queen side is completely irrelevant. It's all happening on the king side, and already black is in huge trouble. But it's happened so quickly. This is what I love about it. Okay, b4. Okay, the knight drops back. And white's threat is simply to play knight g5, take on g6, take on g7, and take on f6, and h7 falls. So knight g5 is the next move with a devastating attack. And this is basically what happens in the game, except, well, it didn't last very long at all. Okay, after this, and white took on g6, and incredibly, after just 17 moves, black is completely lost, and he resigned in this position. Well, was he right to resign? Well, absolutely. Let me just show you how crushing this position is. First of all, we'll play h takes g6. Well, we need to get rid of the knight, and we will do in a second. But first of all, we'll play knight g5, and the point is that white is threatening rook takes pawn, followed by knight e6. So queen d7, now we get rid of the knight, now we're ready. And we play rook takes knight, and that's the end of the game. Pawn takes rook, queen h7 mate, king takes rook, rook f1 check, and it's going to be checkmate. So what about f takes g6? Well, the problem is that this leaves a terrible hole on e6, and after g4, okay, the knight goes back. Knight g5 is a winning move because we're threatening knight e6, and after this we still have rook takes knight, and h7 falls. It's completely crushing. Likewise, knight f4 we take, and h7 at e6. Not to mention f7. Well, that's the triumph of white's strategy. F-file, and queen threatening to take on h7, and the game is over. Absolutely devastating. But what's interesting about the Grand Prix attack is that it's also possible to play positionally, and this is what I want to emphasize. You don't always have to go for the king. And a lot of black players get caught out by this. Okay, this is one of my own games. In this case, instead of knight c6, black plays d6. And here, well, you could play bishop c4 here, but I like this move, bishop b5. It clears the bishop out of the way. As we've seen, you don't necessarily need that bishop to attack on the king side, and there is a huge positional threat here. My opponent casually played bishop g7. It looks like a normal move, but this, I would even say this is a blunder. That's perhaps putting it too strongly. I don't know. No, I'm going to stick with that. I think it's a positional mistake. He should play bishop d7, and play runs along very similar lines to the first game we looked at. You castle, you play your queen to e1, you queen to h4 and f5, and so on, as we'll see later on. But bishop g7 is a mistake. I took on c6. And now, I still want to attack on the king side, but sometimes you can actually switch to playing against black's double c-pawns as well. Let's see how that works in practice. So, okay, I'm still playing with queen e1 and queen h4. But black's possibilities for counterattack are even more limited in this position with the double c-pawns. This is the problem. So black was very worried about f5, understandably, and bishop h6 and so on. So he played f5, blocking the f-pawn. Okay, on the surface of it, not a bad idea, but this certainly doesn't halt my attack. The queen is still in a splendid position, and I have chances to attack down the e file, which I did. So I'm just making room for my rook to come over. So I'm simply threatening to take on f5 and take on e7, and that's problematic. First of all, let's have a look at what happened in the game, which was knight e6. And this doesn't really help. I mean, I have such an obvious exchange sacrifice here. It's pretty horrible. So I took on e6, and now knight g5, threatening the bishop, and obviously threatening queen h7 mate. So he can stop the mate, but here I've picked up, I mean this is a forced sequence, I've picked up 2 pawns for the exchange, and I still have a really strong attack against black's king. You can see all white's pieces are in play, but black's position is really shot through here. And now, well, I'm threatening to play knight e4, and once the knight comes in, it's all over. So black had to play d5, and this actually reveals the problem with the double c pawns, because now you can see c5 is very weak indeed. After f5, okay, I'm winning very easily, because I'm combining my attack on the king side with attacking this pawn on c5. And here, well, if the queen goes back, I take on c5, so it has to play this move. But this is horrible. Okay, basically I'm just forcing weaknesses, so now this square is weak. And, well, I mean, there are actually lots of ways to win this position, but, well, what I wanted to do was bring this knight back into play. And he just, well, there's no way out for black here. Absolutely no way out. And let's just see the end, f6, and now I just crash through. And this is winning, because if the rook comes back, then I take on e5. So you can see how positionally it can be very dubious. Instead of the game continuation, knight e6, let me show you what happens if e6, because this looks like a much safer move, because, you know, we can exchange queens. And this was actually occurred in a game, and in that game white played queen f2, which isn't bad. And after this, the players agreed to a draw. Well, white is still better positionally better in this case, but I think it would have been much clearer if white had switched tactics and played for the endgame. And white has a very clear advantage here. So let's have a look what happens. What I'm trying to do is weaken this c5 pawn. I can do that with e5. Now if he takes, then there are doubled isolated pawns. There's a backward e pawn. This is absolutely horrendous. So the only thing that black can try to do is keep the pawns together with d5, but now you can see that the c pawn doesn't have any protection from a pawn, and now we can attack it with knight a4. This is very similar to the Nimzo Indian with colours reversed, as I'll show you in a second. And now here, well, let's continue the attack with c4. There's an interesting move instead of that as well, but we'll look at c4 first. So what I'm doing is I'm blockading the c pawn. Now I've got to be careful of the counter attack, so I'll play a3. But now I'm switching my rook over, and now if white just builds up with rook d1, plays the king into the middle to cover squares on the d file, so just preventing any kind of counter attack by black on the d file. Then white is in complete control. Don't forget this bishop might drop back to f2, or maybe run over here. Don't forget, we can also attack with h3 and g4 as well. But basically, black is tied to defence in this position. And look at that bishop, absolutely miserable. Well, indeed, both bishops are really poor indeed, and the knight isn't much better either. Positionally excellent for white, and there's another continuation which here is maybe even more clear-cut. You could exchange off bishop for knight, again blockade, and then go for a breakthrough on the king side. So we've just got rid of one of the defenders here, but black is tied to the defence. Excuse me 1 second. And white can concentrate on breaking through with g4. I mean, I've given quite a few variations. I had some fun analysing this position actually, because black can do nothing. I mean, look at those bishops, they're absolutely dreadful. You can't close the position because knight g5 is devastating. So don't forget that you can also, as well as this strong kingside attack, you can play the Grand Prix attack very positionally indeed. Let me just show you one more game before we get into detailed theory. And that's a game that Nigel Short played recently in the playoff in the Gibraltar Open against the Women's World Champion Hu Yifan. He also played the Grand Prix attack. You'll see many games on this DVD by English players. It is a real English speciality. I'm afraid we're all brutes at heart, really. And Hu Yifan also played d6. And we have this position after bishop b5. Well, I think it's probably best for black to play bishop d7 here. But Hu Yifan also played knight c6. And I repeat, I think this is a positional blunder. And Short took on c6 straight away. He knows this position well. And in this position, well, he played king h1, I played queen e1 to h4, but it's also possible to play in a much slower way, much more positional way, which he did. Okay, he played queen e1 now, but his idea was, instead of going on the attack straight away with queen h4, he played b3. Now, again, this shows the positional side to the Grand Prix. So he's making sure that there is going to be no counter-attack with c4. So it's actually, this is a prelude to perhaps later on fixing these pawns with c4 as we saw before. And of course cutting out play on the b file. Now, well, perhaps you can play through some of the variations I've appended there. There's also a game there where, well, white drew, but he should have won very easily. Let's have a look at the game continuation. So Short is simply preparing to play bishop b2, and of course if he can exchange off bishops, dark squared bishops, that will help the attack and help his positional play as well. e5 was played. Okay, so Hu is trying to get play in the middle. But Short plays a very familiar attacking move, f5, and after takes, of course if you leave this, then white has a monstrous attack just by playing g4 and so on. So that's why black took, and now a very familiar strategy, instead of recapturing, we play knight h4 to occupy f5, and if takes, then I mean this is absolutely crushing. Let me just give you a sample variation of how this might work out. So, well, there was already a threat to play queen g3. So we can take and play knight e4, and actually there's no decent defence for black here. If f6, trying to plug a few dark squares, we're still going to play this move. And I think black is just completely lost. There's a threat to check on h6, and this one falls. So if f5, and now there's a forced sequence, queen h4 again, threat to check on h6. So queen e6 looks logical, and now bishop e7, a great move. And black has gone, and that's a very nice move indeed. Black's position has completely fallen apart. White is just winning here. Okay, so instead of that, f4 was played, but g3 still gives white a terribly strong attack. Same thing, knight f5. So knight f6 was played, and here Short should have played knight h6, and that looks really, really strong to me. The problem is that black cannot play the rook to g8, which might save him. White's attack is simply too strong here. But instead he took on g4. Now Short won in the end, but here he was probably lost. This is a rapid game, I should emphasise. Bishop h4 is a winning move, followed by bishop g6. But instead bishop e5 was played, and we're kind of back on normal lines here, and white just has a very strong attack indeed on the f-file. And, well, okay, white broke through. I think I just wanted to demonstrate that it's another typical kingside attack in the Grand Prix. Just let me emphasize the similarities with the Nimzo-Indian. Let me just show you. Here's a typical Nimzo-Indian position. So double pawns. In this case the pawn is on d4, but very often in the Grand Prix, as we've seen, that pawn gets forced up the board. And here the standard Nimzo-Indian attack is bishop a6 and knight a5 to clobber that pawn very quickly. So great similarities between the Grand Prix attack and the Nimzo-Indian, bear that in mind. Okay, so we're going to go into detail in the next clips. That was just to give you a flavour of what you might expect.